July 13, 1943. Munda Point, New Georgia. The tropical darkness hung thick over the Solomon Islands, broken only by the occasional crack of distant artillery fire echoing through the jungle canopy. In a cramped bunker carved from volcanic soil and reinforced with palm logs, Probational Officer Toshihiro Awara sat hunched over a leather-bound diary, his hands trembling not from fear but from malnutrition. The air tasted of copper and rot. Above him, through gaps in the makeshift roof, he could see American star shells bursting like artificial suns, illuminating the jungle in harsh, fleeting brilliance. The 24-year-old officer's uniform, once crisp and proud, now hung loosely on his skeletal frame. His pen scratched across the page, with the mechanical precision of a man who knew he was recording his last testament. Outside, the ground shuddered with each impact of naval shells. Inside, silence held its breath. What Awara wrote that night would become one of the most haunting documents of the Pacific War, a confession not of military defeat, but of a deeper, more fundamental miscalculation. His words carried the weight of a man who had finally understood the true nature of the enemy he faced. This was not simply about courage or tactical brilliance. This was about something his commanders had never adequately explained, something that no amount of Bushido spirit could overcome. The young officer had witnessed firsthand what it meant to fight an adversary whose power lay not in the ferocity of its soldiers, but in the relentless, mechanized abundance of its industry. In the flickering candlelight, as explosions crept closer, Awara documented the moment when idealism collided with industrial reality. The story of how Japan's finest warriors came to face this terrible reckoning began long before Awara's pen touched paper. It began in the meeting rooms of Tokyo, where military planners had drawn up Operation Mo and the subsequent island campaigns with confidence bordering on certainty. The Japanese High Command had studied American capabilities extensively. They knew the United States possessed greater industrial capacity. What they fatally underestimated was the exponential nature of that advantage and the speed with which it could be mobilized. In September 1940, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who understood America better than most of his colleagues, had warned his superiors with prophetic clarity. When asked about the prospects of war with the United States, he replied with unusual candor, "If ordered to fight, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years." Yamamoto's warning went unheeded. The strategic thinking in Tokyo rested on a flawed assumption that a swift, devastating blow at Pearl Harbor would break American will and force a negotiated peace before American industrial might could be brought to bear. The Japanese military elite believed in the primacy of fighting spirit, in the superiority of their warrior ethos, in the notion that discipline and courage could compensate for material disadvantages. This was not mere propaganda, it was genuinely held faith. Japanese officers had been raised on stories of samurai overcoming superior numbers through superior will. Their training emphasized endurance, self-sacrifice, and the transcendent power of the collective spirit. These were not empty concepts. Japanese soldiers demonstrated extraordinary bravery, enduring hardships that would break most men. But bravery, as Awara would come to understand, could not manufacture ammunition. Courage could not conjure supply ships from empty seas. The officers who planned Japan's Pacific campaign expected a short war. They anticipated American resistance would crumble after 6 months of defeats. Intelligence reports suggested Americans lacked the stomach for prolonged conflict, that a nation raised in comfort would sue for peace rather than endure years of sacrifice. These assessments catastrophically misread American character, but more critically, they failed to grasp the industrial transformation occurring across the Pacific. In 1941, when Japan struck Pearl Harbor, the United States maintained substantial industrial overcapacity. Factories built during the Depression sat partially idle. Shipyards operated below potential. Steel mills ran at fractions of their capability. What Japanese planners saw as American weakness was actually latent power waiting for mobilization. Within months of Pearl Harbor, this latent capacity roared to life with a speed that stunned observers worldwide. The statistics became the stuff of legend, numbers so staggering they seemed invented for propaganda. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards launched 2 710 Liberty ships, cargo vessels built at an average rate of 3 every 2 days. The record for constructing a single Liberty ship stood at 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. The Robert E. Peary, built in November 1942, went from keel laying to launch in less than 5 days, a feat that seemed impossible by conventional standards. But Liberty ships represented only one thread in a vast tapestry of production. American yards simultaneously built 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, the backbone of naval aviation power. They constructed 122 escort carriers, 349 destroyers, 203 submarines, and over 300 other naval vessels. The Essex-class carriers alone, each displacing 27,000 tons and carrying up to 90 aircraft, emerged from American shipyards at a pace Japan could never hope to match. Aircraft production told an even more dramatic story. In 1941, the United States manufactured approximately 26,000 military aircraft. By 1944, that figure reached 96,000, nearly 4 times the peak Japanese production that same year. American factories produced 297,000 aircraft during the war, while Japan managed 76,320. The disparity extended beyond mere numbers to encompass capability and sustainability. American aircraft came equipped with superior radios, advanced radar systems, and self-sealing fuel tanks that significantly improved pilot survival rates. Japanese aircraft, designed with different priorities, often sacrificed pilot protection for range and maneuverability. This design philosophy reflected a cultural value system that prioritized offensive capability over the individual warrior's survival. It was a choice that made tactical sense in the short term, but proved catastrophic over prolonged conflict, as experienced pilots became irreplaceable casualties. The industrial gap manifested across every category of military production. American factories manufactured 88,000 tanks compared to Japan's 500. They produced 257,000 artillery pieces, while Japan managed 13,500. In terms of raw resources, the disparity grew even more stark. During the war, the United States produced 11 times as much coal as Japan, 13 times as much steel, and 222 times as much oil. These were not marginal differences. They represented orders of magnitude that fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. A Japanese division might fight with discipline and courage unmatched in military history, but when American forces could call upon 40 times as many artillery shells, the outcome became mathematically predetermined. This industrial avalanche did not immediately manifest on distant Pacific battlefields. In the first 6 months, Yamamoto's prediction held true. Japanese forces ran wild, capturing territory across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with shocking speed. The fall of Singapore, the conquest of the Philippines, the occupation of the Dutch East Indies, these victories seemed to validate the strategy of swift conquest. Japanese officers, including young lieutenants like Awara, believed they were part of an unstoppable wave, warriors serving a divine mission. The early months fostered dangerous confidence. Success bred assumptions that American forces would continue to crumble, that spirit and training would consistently triumph over material advantage. Then came Midway in June 1942, a turning point disguised as a single battle. In one day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, the core of its naval aviation power. More critically, hundreds of experienced pilots and crew went down with these ships, expertise that would take years to replace. American forces, meanwhile, lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, but their pilots largely survived. More ominously for Japan, American shipyards were already constructing the carriers that would replace and vastly exceed these losses. Japanese shipyards, operating at maximum capacity, could not match this pace. In the 3 years following Midway, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers. The United States built 17 fleet carriers of the Essex class alone, not counting the dozens of escort carriers simultaneously under construction. By the time Awara arrived at Munda Point in mid-1943, the strategic situation had fundamentally shifted, though Japanese soldiers on isolated islands often remained unaware of the full picture. The campaign for Guadalcanal, which began in August 1942, demonstrated with brutal clarity what industrial superiority meant in practice. Japanese forces fought with characteristic determination, launching repeated attacks with inadequate supplies and reinforcements. The Tokyo Express, as American forces called it, or Rat Run as Japanese soldiers bitterly termed it, became the desperate lifeline for troops on the island. High-speed destroyer runs under cover of darkness attempted to deliver supplies and reinforcements while avoiding American air power. These missions succeeded sporadically, delivering fragments of what was needed while suffering mounting losses. The diaries of Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal documented the deteriorating reality. Captured journals, translated by American intelligence, painted harrowing pictures of deprivation. The island earned the Japanese nickname Starvation Island, a grim pun on the Japanese pronunciation. Lieutenant Akajima, whose diary chronicled the final months of 1942, recorded the relentless attrition. December 24, 1942. Wakuda Naboru died of illness. In the end, those of weak will die. He was always most eager to drink water. The next day, Sawada and Uchida died of illness. That may be because they were unreasonably overworked. And the day after, Asaba Kazuo also died of illness. Malaria fever affected his mind, and he acted peculiarly. After eating his meal, he died suddenly. The entries continued with numbing regularity, documenting not the glory of combat but the grinding horror of logistical failure. Men died from malaria, dysentery, starvation, and simple exhaustion in numbers that dwarfed combat casualties. An unknown Japanese soldier recorded on December 31, "Since the 28th, not a single grain of rice has been distributed, and during this time 3 pieces of hardtack were issued. Today there were 3 cigarettes and only a bit of the nutrition ration." Another entry noted, "Rice cakes and candies appear in my dreams. I must train myself to suppress these desires." The mundane horror of these words captured a truth that military dispatches obscured. Japan's finest troops were being destroyed not by American bullets, but by the systematic severing of their supply lines. Meanwhile, American forces on Guadalcanal, though facing significant logistical challenges of their own, operated within an entirely different paradigm. When supplies ran short, more arrived. When equipment broke, replacements came. The captured Japanese airfield, renamed Henderson Field, became a symbol of this disparity. American engineers transformed the partially completed runway into a functioning airbase within days, using captured Japanese equipment alongside their own. They maintained the field under constant bombardment, filling bomb craters with pre-measured loads of dirt kept ready at field's edge. Night landings proceeded by flashlight, until engineers jury-rigged a lighting system from captured lamps. The improvisational competence displayed by American logistics personnel contrasted sharply with the Japanese inability to adequately supply their forces just miles away across the island. The contrast became even starker when considering non-essential supplies. American forces received regular deliveries of cigarettes, candy, and Coca-Cola. The famous ice cream barges, floating factories that produced 10 gallons every 7 minutes, became operational in 1943. These vessels, purpose-built to manufacture frozen desserts for troops in tropical climates, symbolized a level of logistical abundance that Japanese officers found incomprehensible. When word reached Japanese commanders that America had dedicated ships specifically to ice cream production, the psychological impact proved as significant as any military defeat. It was one thing to face a numerically superior enemy. It was another to realize your opponent possessed such overwhelming industrial capacity that they could afford to devote shipping tonnage to luxuries while your own troops starved. Captured Japanese soldiers experienced this abundance firsthand in ways that shattered their understanding of warfare. When American forces began taking prisoners in significant numbers, despite the cultural stigma that made surrender nearly unthinkable, these men entered POW camps expecting torture or execution. Instead, they received hamburgers, ice cream, and Coca-Cola. The psychological dislocation proved profound. These were men who had endured months on half rations of cold rice, who had watched comrades die from diseases brought on by malnutrition, who had eaten ants and tree bark to survive. Suddenly, they found themselves eating better than Japanese officers had ever eaten in the field. Some prisoners wept upon tasting ice cream, not from gratitude, but from the devastating realization of what they had been fighting against. If ordinary American prisoners ate this well, what did that say about the relative strength of the two nations? The ice cream became more than a symbol. It became the motif running through the Japanese understanding of American power. It appeared in intelligence reports, in officers' diaries, in the correspondence of Japanese officials. It represented not mere abundance, but a fundamentally different conception of military logistics. Japanese military doctrine emphasized endurance, self-sacrifice, and the ability to fight effectively on minimal supplies. Soldiers took pride in their capacity to endure hardship. American doctrine, by contrast, recognized that well-fed, well-supplied troops fought more effectively than hungry ones. This was not coddling or weakness. It was applied industrial efficiency. Why fight at 60% effectiveness when surplus production capacity allowed troops to fight at 100%? By July 1943, when Aoura sat in his bunker at Munda Point, this pattern had repeated across multiple island campaigns. The strategic situation had become a war of attrition that Japan could not win. Every ship sunk, every aircraft destroyed, every experienced pilot killed represented an irreplaceable loss for Japanese forces. American losses, though sometimes heavy, could be replaced within weeks. Production lines in Detroit, Seattle, and San Diego operated around the clock, churning out replacements faster than they could be destroyed. The mathematics were inexorable. Japan's pre-war inventory of military equipment had been expended in the first year of conflict. Replacements trickled from overtaxed factories, operating with increasingly scarce raw materials. American production, meanwhile, accelerated with each passing month. Aoura had witnessed this disparity firsthand during his months on New Georgia. The supplies that reached his unit came sporadically, delivered by submarines or the occasional destroyer run, never enough to fully provision the garrison. Rice rations shrank steadily. Medical supplies dwindled to nothing, leaving wounded men to die from infections that basic antibiotics would have cured. Ammunition had to be carefully rationed, with strict orders about when firing was permitted. American forces, by contrast, seemed to possess inexhaustible supplies. Their artillery fired with a profligacy that seemed almost wasteful to Japanese observers. Naval bombardments preceded every attack, raining shells in quantities that boggled imagination. One Japanese NCO recorded watching American ships fire thousands of rounds at positions where perhaps a few dozen Japanese soldiers sheltered. The display seemed almost insulting, as if the Americans were demonstrating their surplus firepower. The air war told the same story. American aircraft appeared overhead with monotonous regularity, bombing and strafing with little Japanese interference. Where were the Zero fighters that had dominated Pacific skies in 1942? They existed, but in numbers too small, and with pilots too inexperienced to challenge American air superiority. Japanese pilots in 1943 had, on average, a fraction of the flight hours that their 1941 predecessors possessed. The experienced pilots, the veterans who had trained for years before the war, were mostly dead. Their replacements received abbreviated training and flew inferior aircraft, with mechanical issues stemming from parts shortages and manufacturing shortcuts. They went into combat against American pilots who flew aircraft rolling off production lines with the latest improvements, often with radar-equipped fighters providing cover. The systematic nature of American operations revealed careful planning supported by overwhelming resources. Before ground forces landed, naval bombardment softened defenses. Aircraft struck supply lines and reinforcements. Then came the amphibious assault, conducted with specialized landing craft produced in quantities Japan never attempted to match. American forces brought their own supplies ashore, establishing beachheads that functioned as miniature ports. Within days, these beachheads featured paved roads, supply depots, field hospitals with better equipment than some Japanese rear-area hospitals possessed, and communication systems that coordinated operations across multiple islands simultaneously. Aoura saw all of this. He saw the disparity in artillery, in air support, in the simple fact that American wounded received prompt medical evacuation, while Japanese wounded often lay where they fell, beyond help. He saw American forces eat hot meals, while his own men subsisted on ever-shrinking rations. He saw the electric lights blazing at captured airfields, while his own unit huddled in darkness to avoid drawing fire. Each observation added weight to a conclusion he could no longer avoid. Bravery was not enough. Discipline was not enough. Willingness to die was not enough. Against an enemy that could produce 40 times as many artillery shells, that could replace losses faster than they occurred, that could afford to build ships specifically to manufacture ice cream, individual courage became a tragic irrelevance. The symbolism of ice cream haunted Awaraz's thinking. In his diary, he referenced the stories circulating among Japanese troops about American excess. The ice cream barges, the Coca-Cola, the abundance of small luxuries that spoke to vast surplus capacity. These details carried psychological weight beyond their material significance. They demonstrated that America was not simply wealthier than Japan. It operated in an entirely different economic category. Japan had mobilized its entire industrial capacity for war, requisitioning civilian production, rationing consumer goods, channeling every available resource into military production. And still, it could not match American output. America, meanwhile, simultaneously supplied its own forces, provided massive aid to Britain and the Soviet Union, and still maintained substantial civilian production. American citizens experienced rationing, but nothing comparable to Japanese deprivation. This suggested a productive capacity so vast that even total war consumed only a fraction of it. This realization transformed everything. Awaraz had been raised on stories of Japanese invincibility, of spiritual power overcoming material disadvantages. He had studied the Russo-Japanese War, where outnumbered Japanese forces defeated a larger power through superior morale and tactics. That model no longer applied. Russia in 1905 had been corrupt, poorly led, and fighting at the end of extended supply lines. America in 1943 was none of these things. It was efficiently organized, competently led, and possessed supply lines so robust they delivered ice cream to tropical islands. The old narratives about spiritual power no longer explained battlefield reality. When American artillery fired shells at a rate 10 times what Japanese units could muster, spirit became irrelevant. When American aircraft controlled the skies because they outnumbered Japanese planes 20 to 1, courage mattered little. The diary entry Awaraz composed on July 13, 1943, reflected this devastating clarity. His words carried the weight of disillusionment, the collapse of comforting certainties. He wrote not of tactical situations or immediate dangers, but of larger truths he could no longer ignore. The exact words he recorded would be found after his death, when American forces overran Munda Point weeks later. The diary, translated like thousands of others, provided intelligence officers with insights into Japanese morale and thinking. But it offered something more, a window into the moment when one intelligent, observant officer confronted the mathematical impossibility of Japan's strategic position. Officers across the Pacific Theater reached similar conclusions at different times, each experiencing their own moment of clarity. Some recorded it in diaries, others shared it in private conversations with trusted comrades. Most kept silent, maintaining the facade of confidence required of military leaders. But the knowledge spread through the ranks like slow poison. Soldiers saw the evidence in every engagement, the overwhelming firepower, the endless replacements, the abundance of supplies. They heard it in the constant drone of American aircraft flying unchallenged overhead. They felt it in their empty stomachs as rations shrank and hunger became a constant companion. The most disciplined troops in the world could not fight effectively on 500 calories a day. The bravest soldiers in history could not charge machine guns without ammunition for their own weapons. The transformation in Japanese military thinking happened gradually, expressed through subtle changes in tone in captured documents. Early war diaries brimmed with confidence, recording victories and expressing certainty about ultimate success. By mid-1943, diaries like Awaraz carried a different tone, fatalistic, sometimes despairing but still determined. Officers wrote of dying with honor, of selling their lives dearly, of fighting to the last rather than surrendering. The certainty of victory disappeared, replaced by the certainty of death. Bushido, the warrior code, adapted to accommodate this change. If victory was impossible, then honorable death became the goal. This shift had tragic consequences. fueling the ferocious resistance that characterized the later island campaigns, the kamikaze attacks, the civilian mass suicides on Saipan and Okinawa. But beneath the rhetoric of honorable death lay a harder truth that officers like Awara understood. Japan was losing not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because the war had become a contest of industrial production, and that contest had been lost before the first shot was fired. Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. His warning about 6 months of success, followed by inevitable defeat, proved prophetic with uncomfortable precision. The victories of 1941 and early 1942 represented the expenditure of Japan's pre-war military capital. The ships, aircraft, and trained personnel accumulated over years of preparation. Once that capital was spent, there existed no way to replace it at rates sufficient to match American production. The approximately 37,000 Japanese troops who died on Guadalcanal illustrated this mathematics of attrition. Of these casualties, 9,000 were non-combat deaths caused by starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The Japanese lost 26 warships in the campaign, totaling roughly 117,000 tons. American losses were nearly identical, 26 ships totaling about 126,000 tons. In immediate terms, the naval exchange seemed almost even. But context transformed these numbers. Japan could not replace those 26 ships. Its shipyards, operating at maximum capacity, had no surge potential. The United States, meanwhile, had keels already laid for dozens of replacement vessels. Within a year, American losses at Guadalcanal would be more than replaced by newer, better ships. Japanese losses remained permanent gaps in the fleet. The same pattern repeated for aircraft and pilots. Both sides lost roughly 200 aircraft during the Guadalcanal campaign. For America, this represented about 1% of wartime aircraft production, an acceptable loss rate easily made good. For Japan, it represented a much larger percentage of limited production, including the loss of experienced pilots who could not be replaced. Japanese training programs, constrained by fuel shortages and limited capacity, could not produce pilots at the rate required to replace combat losses. By 1944, the average Japanese pilot had perhaps 100 flight hours of training before entering combat. American pilots typically had 300 to 400 hours, often including gunnery practice and tactical training that Japanese pilots never received due to resource constraints. This disparity in training reflected deeper resource limitations. Aviation fuel, in particular, became increasingly scarce for Japan as American submarines severed the oil shipping routes from the Dutch East Indies. Training flights consumed fuel needed for combat operations, creating impossible choices. Should Japan train pilots adequately but reduce combat sorties, or rush poorly trained pilots into battle? Either choice led to mounting losses. American pilots, by contrast, trained on fuel extracted from Texas, Oklahoma, and California oil fields producing at rates Japan could never approach. The United States produced 1.5 billion barrels of oil during the war. Japan produced 7 million barrels. This 200-to-1 disparity in oil production cascaded through every aspect of military operations, from aviation to naval movements, to the trucks that moved supplies inland from beachheads. The oil shortage exemplified Japan's fundamental strategic vulnerability. The nation possessed virtually no domestic oil production, depending entirely on imports from conquered territories. Protecting these supply lines required naval control of sea lanes stretching thousands of miles. American submarines, operating with increasing effectiveness as the war progressed, systematically destroyed this merchant marine. Japanese merchant shipping tonnage declined from 6.3 million tons at war's start to 1.8 million tons by war's end, despite frantic construction efforts. The merchant fleet, never adequate to begin with, shrank even as demand increased. Without oil, the Navy couldn't operate. Without the Navy, the merchant fleet couldn't be protected. Without the merchant fleet, the oil couldn't be delivered. The strategic logic trapped Japan in an unsolvable dilemma. American strategy explicitly targeted this vulnerability. Operation Starvation, beginning in 1945, saw B-29 bombers laying thousands of mines in Japanese waters, sinking or damaging over 250 ships and effectively sealing the home islands from maritime commerce. Combined with the submarine campaign, this mining effort reduced Japan to near-total economic isolation by mid-1945. Food supplies in Japan proper declined to crisis levels. Industrial production, already constrained by bombing and resource shortages, collapsed further. By July 1945, Japanese munitions production had fallen to approximately 11% of its 1944 peak. The war machine, already grossly inadequate to match American production, essentially ceased functioning months before the atomic bombs fell. But in July 1943, the endgame remained 2 years distant. Officers like Awara understood the strategic situation was untenable, but could not foresee the specific mechanism of defeat. They saw the local evidence: the hunger, the dwindling supplies, the unopposed American aircraft, the massive artillery barrages preceding every enemy attack. They extrapolated from local conditions to the broader war, reaching conclusions that higher command either wouldn't acknowledge or couldn't admit. The official communiques from Tokyo still spoke of glorious victories, of the cowardly enemy being pushed back, of final victory being merely a matter of time. Soldiers on the front lines knew better. They knew because they could count the aircraft overhead, because they felt the hunger in their bellies, because they watched comrades die from preventable diseases. The cognitive dissonance between official narratives and lived reality created profound disillusionment. Soldiers had been told they fought for the emperor, for the nation, for Asian liberation from Western imperialism. These motivations remained real for many, but the promise of victory, always implicit in this narrative, proved hollow. Fighting for a losing cause transformed sacrifice from heroism into tragedy. Some soldiers embraced this tragedy, finding meaning in the act of resistance itself, in fighting well regardless of outcome. Others descended into despair, their diary entries darkening from confident to resigned to nihilistic. A few, very few, surrendered despite the shame this brought. Most fought until they died because that was what was expected, what honor demanded, and because no alternative seemed possible. Awara's final entry, written by candlelight as American artillery crept closer, captured this complex mixture of resignation and resolve. He acknowledged the impossibility of the situation without surrendering to it. He understood that American material superiority would eventually overwhelm Japanese positions, that his death was likely imminent, that the courage of his men would prove insufficient against the machinery arrayed against them. Yet he also reaffirmed his commitment to duty, to fighting effectively until the end, to maintaining discipline and order even as the strategic situation collapsed. This was not delusion or false hope. It was the choice of a professional officer to do his job well even when that job had become futile. The poignancy of this position, rational acceptance of inevitable defeat combined with continued resistance, defined the Japanese military experience from mid-1943 onward. Island garrisons fought ferociously, inflicting heavy casualties on attacking American forces, knowing they would ultimately be destroyed. Naval forces launched attacks knowing they lacked the strength to prevail. Kamikaze pilots flew into American ships fully aware that even successful strikes could not alter the strategic balance. These actions made tactical sense, raising the cost of American victory, but they could not change strategic reality. The mathematics were immutable. Japan could not build ships faster than they were sunk, could not train pilots faster than they were killed, could not produce ammunition faster than it was expended. The industrial gap, evident from the war's beginning but obscured by early tactical successes, had become unbridgeable. What Awara understood, what many thoughtful Japanese officers came to understand, was that the war's outcome had been determined not by any battle or tactical decision, but by decisions made years earlier about industrial investment, resource allocation, and economic development. Japan had entered the modern era rapidly, industrializing with remarkable speed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But it had industrialized later and less completely than the United States. Its industrial base, though impressive by Asian standards, represented a fraction of American capacity. This disparity might have been manageable in a limited conflict, but it proved fatal in total war, requiring sustained industrial production over years. The American economy in 1941 possessed characteristics that made it uniquely capable of rapid war mobilization. Substantial excess capacity meant factories could expand production without requiring entirely new construction. A large, educated workforce could be trained for military production. Continental geography protected factories from enemy attack, ensuring uninterrupted production throughout the war. Vast natural resources provided raw materials without dependence on vulnerable supply lines. Advanced management techniques, developed in peacetime commercial production, translated effectively to war production. These advantages, some structural and some contingent, combined to create an industrial juggernaut that Japan had no realistic prospect of matching. Japanese planners had recognized these disadvantages before the war. Their strategic calculation rested on the hope that decisive early victories would force American negotiation before industrial advantages could be brought to bear. This calculation proved disastrously wrong on multiple levels. It underestimated the speed of American mobilization, the effectiveness of American logistics, and most critically, American political will to accept casualties and pursue total victory. The assumption that a comfort-loving democracy would quit after initial defeats revealed profound misunderstanding of American political culture. Americans, once committed to war, proved willing to sustain enormous sacrifices to win decisively. This will, combined with industrial capacity, made American victory essentially inevitable once the initial Japanese offensive stalled. The symbolism of ice cream thus represented something beyond mere abundance. It symbolized a society wealthy enough to treat war production as merely one sector of a diversified economy. It symbolized surplus capacity so vast that luxuries could be mass-produced and delivered across an ocean without straining essential production. It symbolized confidence, the assurance that material superiority would eventually overwhelm any opponent regardless of their fighting spirit. To Japanese soldiers surviving on wormy rice and tree bark, the knowledge that American forces received ice cream deliveries encapsulated everything they fought against. An enemy whose power derived not from warrior virtue but from industrial might, from the coordination of assembly lines rather than the discipline of boot camps. This was the truth Awara recorded in his final diary entry, not a truth about tactics or battles, but about the fundamental mismatch between Japanese courage and American capacity. His words, recovered after American forces secured Munda Point in early August 1943, joined thousands of similar documents in intelligence files. Translators and analysts read these diaries, seeking tactical information about Japanese positions and morale. They found that and more, a portrait of soldiers confronting the futility of their situation, maintaining discipline and fighting spirit in the face of certain defeat, dying not because they lacked courage, but because courage alone could not overcome the disparity in industrial production. The epilogue to Awara's story writes itself across the remaining years of war. Munda Point fell. New Georgia was secured. American forces continued their island-hopping campaign, each target selected to bypass Japanese strongpoints, while seizing locations necessary for continued advance toward Japan proper. The pattern established at Guadalcanal repeated. Japanese forces resisted fiercely, inflicting heavy casualties, but ultimately succumbed to overwhelming material superiority. American industrial production continued accelerating even as Japanese production collapsed under bombing, resource shortages, and systematic destruction of merchant shipping. By August 1945, Japan's industrial capacity had been substantially destroyed, its navy effectively annihilated, its air force reduced to kamikaze attacks by barely trained pilots, its merchant marine sunk, and its people facing starvation. The atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki provided the final impetus for surrender, but the outcome had been determined long before. It had been determined when American factories demonstrated they could build ships faster than Japan could sink them, aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, weapons faster than they could be used. It had been determined by the mathematics of steel production, oil extraction, and manufacturing capacity. Individual battles mattered tactically. They cost lives and influenced timing, but strategically, they could not alter the fundamental imbalance. The ice cream, that recurring symbol, remained relevant even in the war's final chapter. When Japan surrendered, occupation forces brought abundance with them. Japanese civilians, many near starvation after years of increasingly desperate rationing, encountered American soldiers who distributed chocolate bars and canned goods with casual generosity. The contrast between victor and vanquished manifested not just in military terms, but in the simple fact that American servicemen remained well-fed, while Japanese children begged for food. This was the ultimate expression of industrial might, the capacity to project power across oceans, while simultaneously ensuring that even the lowest-ranking American soldier ate better than Japanese civilians at home. The lesson inscribed in Awara's diary, written by candlelight in a bunker that would become his tomb, echoed across history with uncomfortable clarity. Wars between industrial nations are won in factories as much as on battlefields. Production capacity determines strategic potential. Training time and equipment quality often matter more than individual courage. Logistics, the unglamorous business of supplying armies with food, fuel, and ammunition, decides campaigns more reliably than tactical brilliance. These were hard truths for a military culture that prized warrior spirit above material considerations. They remain relevant truths for any examination of modern warfare, where industrial capacity and economic strength constrain what military forces can realistically achieve regardless of their fighting quality. Awara's story and the stories of thousands like him remind us that soldiers do not determine strategy. They execute plans made by others, plans constrained by resources they cannot control. Japanese troops displayed extraordinary courage, endured terrible hardships, and fought with discipline that impressed even their enemies. They lost anyway because bravery cannot manufacture the ammunition that has been expended, cannot conjure the ships that have been sunk, cannot replace the pilots who have been killed. In the calculus of total war, production rates matter more than individual heroism. Assembly lines determine outcomes more reliably than battlefield valor. This was the terrible realization that Awara recorded in his final entry, that all the courage, all the training, all the willingness to sacrifice meant nothing against an enemy that could simply outproduce any losses they suffered. The war had become a contest of industrial output, and that contest was over before it began. What remained was the dying, the slow attrition of Japanese forces isolated on islands throughout the Pacific, fighting because honor demanded it, because duty required it, because surrender was unthinkable, but knowing, as Awara knew, that the outcome was inevitable. The young officer's pen fell silent on July 13, 1943. In the weeks that followed, American forces overran Munda Point. The bunker where Awara wrote his final thoughts became another casualty statistic, another position secured in the methodical advance toward Japan. His diary, like so many others, survived him, providing testimony to a truth that military histories sometimes obscure. Wars are decided not just by the brave, but by those who can supply the brave with the tools they need to fight. In a contest between courage and capacity, capacity won. In a war between warriors and factories, the factories prevailed. And in the end, all the valor in the world could not overcome the simple fact that one nation could build ice cream barges while the other's soldiers starved. This was the legacy written in those final pages, preserved in translated documents, carried forward in the memories of those who read them, that freedom and abundance, backed by industrial might, had proven more powerful than discipline and sacrifice backed only by ideology. The machines had spoken, and their verdict was final.